Hello, it's Friday, and you would know what that means. It's time to talk about vampires. New Orleans has a long history of vampires, including a history with one of my favorites, Lestat de Lioncourt. But we're not going to talk about him today. Today, we are going to talk about the Casket Girls. The French established three main outposts along the Gulf Coast. These three outposts were called Mobile, Biloxi, and New Orleans. The founders of New Orleans were explorers, trappers, and traders. The explorers were predominantly male. Catholic priests in the region became concerned that without wives, the future of Christian evangelism in the French territory was at risk. They turned to the bishops and mayors of French port cities, who gladly agreed to empty their jails and brothels and transport these undesirable women to the colonies. These women were not meek, forgiving, and they were not the virtuous wives that the colonial men sought. They did not make good wives. So, the priest had to come up with another idea. They asked King Louis IV for assistance, and he, in turn, tasked the Bishop of Québec with appealing to convents and orphanages in France. They sought out virtuous young women who they could contract to come to the colonies, hoping that they would prove to be better candidates for marriage. Thus, the Casket Girls were contracted to be wives of the men in the colonies. The contracted young women heard of the programs to bring women to the colonies through the nuns of their convent, school, or orphanage who wanted to reduce the number of girls who were in their care. The women then made marriage contracts with men who arranged for their trip. They traveled from their homes to port cities in France. Before boarding ships to America, once a ship had been filled, the women sometimes found themselves waiting for months for the next ship to take off into the ocean. The passage across the Atlantic took months. The ships usually stopped for supplies and drinking water in Haiti, at Cape Francois, now known as Cape Haitian, on the island's north coast, before they pushed on into the Gulf of Mexico. The voyage was a difficult one, and many of them died from yellow fever and other travel-related diseases along the way. In 1727, the Ursuline nuns from Rouen, France, arrived in New Orleans with the mission to provide education to women of the colony and to evangelize the natives. In 1728, when New Orleans was only 10 years old, the third consignment of marriageable women arrived. The nuns took charge of the newly arrived girls, and the women lived with the nuns until they were married off to the men of the colonies. When the Casket Girls arrived, Biloxi was the capital of French-occupied North America, and it was called La Louisiane, while New Orleans was still just an outpost. The Louisiana Territory was called New France at the time, and it stretched from some of the Caribbean isles up into present-day Canada. The French colonies were not quite what the girls had expected. Most of the Casket Girls didn't see much of their spouses. Their spouses were trappers and traders, and they were rarely home. So these women who were used to working in packed convents and orphanages took charge of lonely households. This all sounds very normal, without a fanged fiend or a bloodsucker in sight. So, how did the Casket Girls become the vampires of legend? There are two things about the tale of the girls that vampire lore seems to focus on. One being the caskets, or cassettes, that the girls brought with them from France, and the other being the convent. The legend begins when the Casket Girls arrived in the city. These women were found to be unnaturally pale, so much so that their skin blistered and reddened beneath the Louisiana sunlight within moments of docking. The girls lived with the Ursuline nuns before their marriage occurred. Unfortunately, most of the Casket Girls were placed into unwanted marriages where they were mistreated by their husbands, while those left unwed were forced to find other means of survival. Hearing of this mistreatment, the king ordered that these young women return to their home in France. In preparation for their departure, the cassettes, or caskets that the women brought were filled with all of their possessions and carried into the third floor of the Ursuline convent for storage. The third floor had always been sealed off and the windows shuttered, so it shocked the nuns when they returned to fetch the girls' belongings. The luggage was found to be completely empty. After a thorough search of the third floor, none of the girls' items were ever recovered. So, of course, it was determined that there was something supernatural afoot. The nuns went out of their way to ensure that nothing and no one would ever enter or exit the space again. Some legends even state that the shutters were nailed closed with nails that had been blessed by a pope. Some stories even say that there were 800 nails that were used to seal up that third floor. It is there, it is said, that the Casket Girls still remain locked away. Without those blessed nails, those young women would be roaming the streets, searching for the next neck to sink their teeth into. One modern story that happened in the 1970s was about a couple of ghost hunters who ditched a tour of the convent and hid in the courtyard with the intention of spending the night monitoring the third floor windows. In the morning, their bodies were found, completely drained of blood. This legend of the Casket Girls has circulated since the early 20th century. The rumors of vampires and the undead had a renaissance, with the legend becoming increasingly popular when the books of Anne Rice began hitting the shelves. Okay, I couldn't help myself. We had to talk a little bit about Lestat. Alright, that's all I have for you guys. See you next Friday.